For the agent that must be in the know, Medicare Industry Insider discusses critical insight, noteworthy trends, and upcoming issues in the Medicare market.
Deciphering and debating the legislation, regulation, and what's happening in the market. I'm Jalen Jackson.
And I'm Rachel Brameyer, and we're going to talk shop, dive deep into these complex topics, and make them understandable and actionable.
If you've ever wondered where the world of Medicare is going and how to prepare for the future, Medicare Industry Insider is the resource you've been looking for.
Welcome to another episode of Medicare Industry Insider. I'm Rachel Brameyer.
And I'm Jalen Jackson.
And today we are going to focus on end-of-life planning. So specifically as an agent, it's important for you to look at not only what resources are available to caregivers, what insurance options are available, but also overall just being a phenomenal resource for your client if they are looking for end-of-life planning. This is going to be a really good episode, not only for yourself to kind of think about what you've got in place, what you have for your office and facility, what your end-of-life plans are going to be if something were to happen to you unexpected. But more importantly, we're going to focus on what your client needs and also caregivers in this situation. This is a huge opportunity to not only keep your clients, but also retain them, being a resource in your community and for your clients.
Absolutely. And I think, the biggest thing is everything in this episode is going to be geared around making the hardest conversation most people will have a lot easier. Mm-hmm. What you're probably not going to hear a lot about today is life insurance, because that should be a foregone conclusion. If you're doing your job, that should be the least of anybody's worries. Obviously, an incredibly important part of end-of-life planning is planning financially for that, but we're going to talk a little more about the weird little technical things, the nuances of different things that your clients might have in place or might need to get in place, and this, cacophony of things that they need to accumulate and put together in, I'm going to call it a death file, because that's a really common terminology for it. They need to have some kind of file or folder or system where they can put together their passwords, their banking info, at least a list of where everything is stored. The life insurance is in the safe deposit box, and so is the will, but we gave a copy of the trust to the attorney to keep for us.
But who's the attorney?
But who's the attorney? Yeah. So making sure that they have, business cards for you, their agent, business cards for their attorney, and anyone else involved. If there's any, additional planning, who they would like to write their obituary or give a eulogy.
Or maybe they write it themselves.
Pallbearers, yeah, things like that, where they want to be buried, how they want to be memorialized, lots of things like that. But again, just accumulating all of that into one place. That way, whoever's that task falls to doesn't have to hunt around during an already incredibly stressful time. In many, many cases, you're talking about from death to funeral being less than a week in most cases, sometimes as little as 2 or 3 days. And that's a lot of information to pull together for anybody, much less if you have to hunt around for all of it.
Yeah, so the things that you could have mentioned, those are good things either to look around in your community to see what things in the community offer some of the help with, maybe assistance on writing, obituaries, or maybe information gathering. Maybe there's an attorney who is totally fine with storing a lot of those documents as a second backup that you can maybe network and work with. But I think a lot of that is if you're looking at a place, maybe you as an agent create a place where they can store their passwords and give it to them as a resource, or basically it's going to be something that just think about everything that they need to gather and what things can you either provide to them or find someone in the community that maybe could provide those to them. As simple as a password list, I know as well as everyone else does it, those change quite often and it's very difficult to keep up. But having a password list is really, really important, because even things like social media decisions, how do they access it? Do you want it shut off? Do you want it to be ongoing? Because then it's, something that maybe a hacker could hack into later. So there's a lot of things that end of life things to think about that are never fun to think about. It is a lot of work, But what can you do as an agent to like either find resources, find community helpers, or create resources if you can't find them? I think it's a good opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Well, and as an agent, obviously a lot of your work deals with the client's insurance.
Mm-hmm.
So there's some big considerations. I think one of the most common questions when it comes to end-of-life planning is hospice. What it is, how it works, what people can expect going on to hospice, and when to make that decision. And, again, depending on your particular client and beneficiary situation, it could be an individual decision. It could be a family decision. Could be, a POA or a guardian. But in general, this is care for someone who's expected to live 6 months or less if an illness runs its normal course. Now, it doesn't mean you're cut off after 6 months. You can still get hospice care as long as it makes sense and you're certified as terminally ill. But you can get it for a couple 90-day benefit periods plus 60-day benefit periods in an unlimited manner after that, again, as long as your terminal status is recertified. But during each benefit period, you can change providers. You can work with your doctor during that first period to certify that you are terminally ill, that that's being recertified, and then whether or not you still qualify for hospice after each of those periods.
And hospice is something that is separate from the insurance that you all can write and help them get a hold of. Basically, it ends whatever they currently have. If it's Medicare, if it's a Medicare Advantage, whatever you've got them set up on, it specifically ends and pivots to hospice. But what usually is confusing is Medicare will take care of people until they're no longer getting better. So one of the big ones are like if you had ALS or Alzheimer's, dementia, that's usually when a doctor says this person's no longer getting better is when Medicare drops them. And that's when a home health care plan or something like that is important to pick up. So in this particular case, this is when the doctor says, whoops, this person's not getting any better anymore. You have to make a decision then. So I'm going to share a personal story of my grandpa had cancer and they were doing everything they could to get him better. And then at a certain point, the doctor said he's not getting better anymore. And there was like a few hour window where his caregiver, so it'd be, my mom, her brother, and his spouse, my grandma, had to make a decision if they wanted to do hospice or what the next step was. Because hospice is in your head as a caregiver. You're sitting here going, okay, this person's no longer getting better, which is a hard pill to swallow.
Yep.
And it took him a couple hours to make that decision of like, what's next? You're either going into like a long-term care facility, home health care facility, if it's an option. But regardless, if that's the case, like your normal insurance is not taking care of you anymore. So there was a couple hour window where they didn't make a decision and then they finally decided on hospice. So in that window, basically he was uninsured. So definitely having that conversation with your clients of like, hospice is an important decision to make quickly, but it's also probably one of the hardest decisions to make quickly.
Sure.
So just keeping that in mind, it's one of the things that one will stop, and then as soon as hospice picks up, it'll start picking up everything. The other big thing that we want to go into is medications.
Yeah, and just looking at, once you're on hospice, generally hospice will cover any medications that are related to that hospice coverage. So managing pain, managing nausea, constipation, anxiety related to that terminal condition. What's not going to generally be covered are those maintenance type medications. So typically those will begin stopping once you're on hospice in many cases. If you do still have need of those for some reason that are, any medications unrelated to your terminal condition, you'll want to make sure that you maintain that Part D coverage to make sure that you still have coverage for any of those types of drugs. And the biggest other question we get is kind of, how do you find a provider for hospice, and where can you actually get that care?
Right. Yeah. So it's really interesting because hospice care can be, is not tied to a specific place, which is oftentimes a little confusing, which as an agent, that's important to kind of take a look at your community and see what you can do in your local area. For example, hospice can be at home or in a facility like a nursing home or hospital, or even a separate hospice center. Sometimes they're connected to nursing homes. But usually, unfortunately, it's kind of sad if you want to go to a nursing home or hospice center, you usually have to have already been a member or, living in those facilities too. So that is something that you kind of have to like double check on and see what's available in your area. For example, again, I'll go back to my grandpa. He was really adamant about going home, but there was no hospice care where he lived. And then looking at different facilities, they were all full, or they required like a wait list. Maybe they were a facility that was a unassisted living or a nursing home that also transitioned into a hospice center, but only for the people who currently lived there. So definitely take a look at, what is available. But usually, your doctor or hospital discharge planner can help you find either that location or whoever that resource is. You can also look at, which I thought was interesting, in the phone book. They're listed in the phone book. You can also look for referral services by the Area on Aging or local United Way chapter, or some solutions for that.
The most important takeaway so far this episode is that Rachel still has a phone book.
It props the leg of that chair up.
Yeah, absolutely. But no, fantastic points. And I think one of the kind of the interesting part of hospice that we deal with, maybe not as regularly as others, but we do get questions a lot about, dropping coverage. So, we're on hospice. Should we drop our Medicare supplement? Should we drop our Medicare Advantage plan, our Part D plan? And what a lot of people don't consider is that despite the odds, sometimes people get better. And stopping hospice can be just as complicated as starting it. Mm-hmm. And I think, looking at if you do somehow end up in remission or get better, and you do have that right, you can stop hospice at any time. If you choose to do that, you'll sign a form that includes the date that the care is going to end. Mm-hmm. You should never be forced or feel obligated to sign anything about stopping hospice when you start hospice. Until you are actually ready to stop care, don't sign anything. Make sure your clients are aware of their rights and obligations. Or again, in many cases, when we get into a hospice situation, it may be a power of attorney, a guardian, a conservator that you're dealing with. So making sure that they are educated on their options. If you're in an MA plan, you can keep that plan, pay premiums. Same with Medicare supplement or your Part D plan. And as long as you're still a member of that plan, when you stop hospice, you'll start picking up care under that plan pretty much without interruption.
So that's why it's really important to talk to your clients, especially if they're like, should I drop my plan or not? It's going to be a personal decision because they may be paying premiums on their supplement, but you never know if they're going to want to end hospice, because if they end and go back, then you're left with just original Medicare in that particular case. Exactly. So just making sure that you've had that conversation with your client about, potentially what could happen if they dropped it. Yeah. Also, the drug situation too. For example, like if they're on hospice, it covers pain, nausea, constipation, and other anxiety related to that terminal condition, but a lot of their Part D is not covered anymore. So if they are still wanting that person to stay on something, that's going to be connected to that insurance. So if they dropped it, you don't have a choice anymore. You're out of pocket.
Absolutely. Hospice can definitely cause a lot of confusion and chaos, and rivaled perhaps only by the next thing we'll talk about, which is Medicaid. Mm-hmm. Medicaid is definitely a confusing program for beneficiaries, especially nowadays with redeterminations going on and sort of questions of eligibility and how folks can actually get access to Medicaid. Longer wait times than expected, and particularly not even on the healthcare side, but on the long-term care side. And I think there's a lot of pitfalls and kind of hidden traps in Medicaid when it comes to long-term care. And right now today we've got 1 in 5 Americans receiving Medicaid in some form, and in a lot of cases that is Medicaid for the purpose of covering a nursing home stay.
Yeah, and unfortunately, it can help with nursing home and home health care, but optional are like all the extra things like private duty nursing services, personal care, hospice. There's a lot of extra things like home health enrollees with chronic conditions. They don't have to cover that part with Medicaid. So it's definitely going to depend on the state-specific stipulations in terms of what that Medicaid can cover. So just making sure that if they are on Medicaid, that you're doing a little research. If they're asking about end-of-life type services or support or help, basically, you'd have to to make some pretty hard decisions with Medicaid. But once you go into hospice, it is going to kick in and take over the Medicaid side too, just like on the Medicare. So that's another big takeaway.
Yep, absolutely. And I think the biggest thing too for Medicaid is understanding if you are relying on that for long-term care, and we'll talk a little more about this later, but understanding the financial implications. There are oftentimes slightly less restrictive income and asset rules if you're getting Medicaid specifically for long-term care, but that doesn't mean it absolves you of any financial responsibility. In a lot of states, they can levy that against the estate of a deceased individual to kind of recoup those costs.
Yeah. We usually hear Medicaid, one of the main reasons people get on is medical debt. So sometimes people can have their entire life savings ready to go. And unfortunately, like, that end of life time is where a lot of that gets drained. And sometimes people end up on Medicaid while they're going through their end of life stage. So just something to be aware of. But yeah, we just want to touch on Medicaid. The next thing we want to go over is legal decisions. So we're not an attorney. Neither one of us are attorneys by any means, but letting you know some of the legal terminology, what they mean, and kind of why they're important can at least help you have like good conversations if you are talking to financial planners, if you're talking to attorneys, or if you're talking to your client about why it's important to go to an attorney, just knowing the main terminologies that they may use.
Absolutely. And again, not attorneys, not legal professionals in any capacity, barely professionals in any capacity, but we do want to talk a little bit about things like wills, trusts, other estate planning tools, mostly, kind of what the differences are and what uses they may serve your clients. And this is where a referral partner or a group of referral partners that are attorneys, depending on what market you list in, having somebody in every zip code might be useful, just to make sure you can help serve those clients. So starting with kind of the most basic, the classic, the will, this document that states who gets what when you pass away. It names guardians of children if you have children. It specifies who's going to be the executor of your estate, things like that. This is where grandma dishes out all of the china and where grandpa divvies up the coin collection. And believe it or not, lawyers charge extra if you want to have the big dramatic reading in a room full of your loved ones. So people need to be aware of that. But if you're looking for some Agatha Christie level intrigue, I'm sure your attorney is happy to help.
A living will is actually the same thing as a will, but it's what you have put together while you are still alive. So basically divvying out everything that you want, what you do and don't want to happen. The next thing is a power of attorney. So we wanted to go through this because there's definitely different levels of power attorneys. There's different terminology in terms of power of attorney, but a power of attorney basically is a named person who can make decisions for you. You can have limited, general, durable, and springing. Those are 4 different types of power of attorneys. A limited is a person who you give power of attorney to act on your behalf for a very limited time. So exactly what it says usually ends at a specific time as listed in the document. General is what we usually hear of for a will. Usually people will put a general power of attorney. It's more comprehensive. It gives the attorney, in fact, all the powers and rights that you have yourself. So a general power of attorney would basically be what you would pick if you were incapacitated or need someone to help you out with your finances. They also can help with a lot of end-of-life decisions, or even before that if you are incapacitated. Durable is, it can be general or limited, but it basically is whenever you become incapacitated. And if you don't have one in place and you become incapacitated, no one can represent you unless a court appoints a conservator or guardian, which is a little scary. And then springing is basically a attorney, in fact, to act for you if you become incapacitated, but does not become effective until you actually are incapacitated.
Well, and I think the thing that people get wrong about POA, power of attorney, is that it takes away beneficiary choice. In most cases,
that's true.
A beneficiary can always act on their own interests. Power of attorney just allows someone else to also take action, or, like we've said, in certain cases, take action if the beneficiary cannot. But in most cases, It just means that there is an extra person that can do business as you functionally. So lots of options depending on, what things you feel like you need to put in place. Lots of different ways that this can be set up to either give someone help even while you can make your own decisions, which again can always kind of overrule the POA if you are cogent and able to make your own decisions. But the biggest thing is, if you can't speak for yourself, this person needs to be someone you trust to speak on your behalf. And that's really the big point and purpose of a power of attorney, is who do you feel will carry out your wishes most effectively? And part of that is you need to have that conversation with them. Do not assign someone power of attorney just because they are a relative, just because you trust them. You need to discuss what you expect out of that person and that they're willing to do that. And I think that's a big thing that people fail to recognize. If you say, hey, if I become incapacitated, I really don't want this type of care, and you're telling someone as a power of attorney that that's what you want, you need to be sure that they will act in accordance with your wishes if that's what you're going to do. If you feel like they might not act in accordance with your wishes, or if you feel like they're not capable of making that hard decision, whatever that decision is that you want them to make, maybe one of these other mechanisms is a better fit, something like an advanced medical directive where you can line out, these are the types of care I'm willing to receive, these are the types of care I'm not willing to receive. If you need to shock my heart back, that's fine, but I do not want to go on a ventilator. Things like that are what you can build into an advanced medical directive to make sure that you're receiving care in the way that you're comfortable with.
Yeah, and speaking of power of attorney, you can have financial and medical, and they do not have to be the same person. So if you have someone in your family that is willing to make medical decisions, but maybe isn't the best person with money, you could put a different person in that role as well. And then the other thing that happens is, if you don't have a power of attorney, there's also something called a conservatorship, which is something that you probably don't want to end up with, but a lot of people unfortunately do because they have not selected a power of attorney. And a conservatorship is when a court assigns someone the right to make those decisions for you. So it is something that can take a little bit of time too if there isn't one appointed. And so basically the family is stuck waiting for that to happen in the meantime. So it's important end of life decisions. And then of course, like, you can also put we talked about wills, but trusts are very similar. They just are a legal entity created under the state law that manages and distributes assets to beneficiaries. So it's very similar to a will. You would want to talk to an attorney to see which one's right for you.
Absolutely. And, oftentimes trusts are used to hold and transfer assets, for multiple generations, or, maybe, leave the type of legacy that you want that is more controlled by you. But again, talk to your attorney, because there's a lot of people who think wills and trusts will do certain things that they won't actually do. So definitely talk to a trusted legal professional to make sure that you're getting what you think you are getting. And again, on the POA side, medical versus financial, here's what you need to understand as an agent. If you're talking to someone and they say, yes, I've got POA for mom or dad or whoever, make sure that if you're talking about writing an insurance policy, a medical POA is not generally sufficient to sign an application on behalf of that client. Purchase of insurance is not a medical decision, it is a financial decision. So understand what type of POA may be required, and understand what kind of documentation your carriers may require to process that application on behalf of that beneficiary.
Very good points. So the next thing we wanted to pivot into is caregiver resources, because unfortunately at the end of someone's life, it's important to know what's available to you, know what resources are available, and then as an agent, knowing what you can give to your clients that they could pass along, or if they do happen to be in a caregiver situation, that you may be able to help them out. In fact, nearly 66 million Americans are caring for an aging person. So it is, even if you haven't, and that's another thing, when you're meeting with your clients, an average age of a caregiver is late 50s, early 60s, sometimes usually female. So while you're meeting with your turning 65 clients, or even prior to that, having those caregiver resources, those caregiver seminars, basically to help them know what is available to them so they can help their aging loved ones.
Absolutely. And, I think as we go through some of these resources like respite care, so allowing that respite from caring for somebody while they're, receiving that hospice or nursing home care, inpatient facility, it can provide that temporary relief for that caregiver to, just relax, take a breath. It's an incredible weight to be responsible for a whole person's being and health and well-being. So being able to give them that break can be incredibly beneficial. Sometimes it can be up to 5 days. It can be, hey, I just need an afternoon to go get a mani-pedi and relax, something like that. So there's a lot of options for caregivers and those beneficiaries to provide them facility care, adult daycare, things like that might help take a little bit of the load off. And there's a lot of different ways that someone might qualify for access to that program. And there's some great tools that we're going to have in the show notes for how to identify programs that might work with you on that care.
Yeah, so respite care is incredibly important as a caregiver, at least to know it's available. And then in addition to that, there are a ton of Medicare resources that you as an agent can provide to that person. And we'll give a couple examples and you can chime in as well. But there's things like helping your client prepare to leave a hospital, nursing home, or other settings. There's a reference on basically what tests are covered by Medicare. So if you're taking care of a person, knowing what can and can't be covered by Medicare and what you're going to be paying out of pocket is important. There are hospital compare options on Medicare.gov where maybe that person is going to have to shift to another hospital. You can kind of dig a little bit deeper, and they've got a lot of things like star ratings, commentary. You can look at all of the details on that hospital as well. There's an elder care locator tool. It's part of a Administration on Aging, U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. It basically will go through and connect older adults. So maybe this is a person who really can't get out of the house very much, but you want them to have some companionship, which usually helps people live a little bit longer. That's a really good resource for that.
Yeah, and I think there's so many other great things out there. Most states are going to have, like here in Missouri, it's called the Long-Term Care Ombudsman Program, but they're going to have some kind of, advocacy group or system set up through the state that's going to help advocate for people in the long-term care setting, answer questions about long-term care facilities. There's also a lot of great Medicare resources about things like hospital and long-term care discharge and your rights and responsibilities. If you're being discharged from care, again, great resources on hospice and some of the other things we've talked about. But a lot of times that caregiver is just as important as the beneficiary when it comes to getting this information and knowledge across. So what I heavily recommend to agents, something that I always made a practice of, just figure out who that caregiver is. And sometimes it's a spouse, but oftentimes it's a kid or a neighbor or someone like that. Figure out who that caregiver is and involve them in the conversation. Obviously, protect personal health information, get HIPAA releases if you need to, whatever makes sense, whatever those clients are comfortable with. But the more you can share with that caregiver before they become a caregiver, the better equipped they're going to be to take care of those clients, improve quality of life, improve that aging in place experience. And when end-of-life planning comes into play, being able to really make the most of the situation.
Yeah, I think it's super important with all of that, just to make sure that you're getting in front of the caregiver regardless, know what options and resources. Like Jalen said, there's so many resources that are available on Medicare.gov that we can definitely provide. The other thing to know about is filial responsibility laws and how many states or what states do have those. So some states require some people to be caregivers. There actually are 29 states to be exact that have laws in place that say, if you are a child of someone who is aging or disabled, that you have to take care of them.
Yep. And that can range pretty widely in what those exact responsibilities look like. There are some states where you can be held criminally or civilly liable if you're not willing to pay for your parents' care. There are some states where the penalties are much more lax. And of course, quite a few that have no filial responsibility laws whatsoever. But just be understanding, especially, and again, check the show notes. We'll have all these notes here, but check those states. If you've got clients in those states, understand that their children may have a financial responsibility to care for those clients as they age. And again, providing those resources, providing access to information, and again, looking at it as an opportunity to say, hey, listen, you're responsible for mom and dad one way or another. Mom and dad think they can't afford this long-term care policy, this home health care policy, whatever it is. At the end of the day, it's up to them and you to make a plan for the future. In this state where you all live, you're responsible for them. Maybe it's something you should consider taking out. Mom and dad can pass underwriting. Of course, everything looked good. They're willing to do it. If you're willing to pay the premiums, this could save you quite a bit in the long run. So conversations to have, resources to provide. But if you've got clients in any of those 29 states, it's critical to get in front of those beneficiaries so they understand what could happen in the long run.
100%. Really good point. So I always like to use the terminology, you don't need insurance for everything, but it's important to have a plan. It's important to help your clients have a plan so that if they, in fact, are the ones going through the end of life, or if they're a caregiver helping someone go through the end of their life, you're available to them, and you've provided resources to make sure that they know what is available, know what options they have, especially like the respite care, caregiver resources, and then especially just like that story I mentioned where you've got a gap in between coverage. What does that mean for you if you're going from what your normal Medicare plan insurances are, or veterans or whatever they've got, over to hospice, and what that looks like and how that decision's made. It's just important as an agent to make sure that you know what's available in your community, the resources, what are hospice care locations, anything like that adds extra value to you, adds you as a resource in your community, and in turn can help you get a lot of networking opportunities and referrals because you are a resource in your community.
Absolutely.
So with that, we will wrap up. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and we'll catch you next time.